Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. This past October, PRI and the Claremont Institute teamed up to celebrate our 40th anniversaries on a cruise in the Mediterranean. The cruise started in Barcelona with stops in Mallorca, Marseille, Monte Carlo, Nice, Florence, and ending in Rome. Throughout the cruise, we had some great lectures. The theme of the lectures was The Future of America and the West, Liberty, Sovereignty, and Self-Government. Over the next few weeks, we'll be providing you with these lectures from the nation's top scholars and writers. This first lecture, titled Liberalism and Polarization of American Politics, is by Charles Kesler, editor of the Claremont Review, and PRI fellow Steve Hayward, and moderated by Claremont Institute President Ryan Williams. Thanks for joining us.
Liberalism and the Polarization of American Politics. So I wanted to just set the scene quickly and then turn it over to Charles and Steve to discuss this issue. I mentioned in my remarks that we've really had a liberal century in the 20th century, and I think that's definitely true, although in the last 35 years especially, you know, there was, in the 50s there was there's a consensus in America, a post-war consensus. The distance between a moderate Republican and a moderate Democrat in the legislature was not that far. They were quite close to each other. But over the last 3 decades, we have sorted ourselves ideologically at the national level, and especially at the national politician level. So that distance between the moderate Democrat and the moderate Republican has grown significantly. I think that's part of why we have such polarized politics in terms of the national policy debate, is because of the Republican Party has gotten more right-wing and the Democratic Party has gotten more left-wing. Plenty of movement within those terms, but that's broadly speaking what has happened. But I think the deepening divisions really have to do with more than just that fact. I think it has a lot to do with the divisions that I outlined in my opening remarks, which has really led us to a situation of two visions of what the Constitution ought to mean and how it ought to govern, two visions of justice, really two constitutions. Charles has talked a lot about this. So I wonder, Charles, if you could start us off just by talking a little bit about what you've written well about, picking up a term of one of our colleagues, Angelo Codevilla, of this problem of the two constitutions and our cold civil war that we seem to be embroiled in.
Yeah, so this term, America's cold civil war, is one that Angelo Codevilla, who writes frequently for the Claremont Review, introduced into our conversation. And I think it's a useful term because it's a cold civil war, meaning it's not a hot war, a shooting war, fortunately, but it is in a way a kind of civil war, as Ryan is saying. There are sort of at least two constitutions competing in America today, the liberals' constitution and the conservatives' constitution. There's some doubt about whether the conservatives understand their own constitution, which is another wrinkle. But essentially, modern American liberalism began more than 100 years ago, as Ryan was saying, in the progressive era. And at that point, they pledged allegiance to a new constitution, which they called the living constitution. And the term that they chose implied rather openly that the original Constitution, that is the Constitution of 1787, the written Constitution, was a dead one, or was dying, was on life support, and that the living Constitution would survive because it was open-ended, it was growing, it was evolutionary, it would adapt to new circumstances, and so forth. To the extent that the original Constitution would also survive, it would do so only as in a kind of convergence with the living Constitution. And for a couple of decades, I think liberals and many conservatives thought that the two constitutions, the liberals or the living Constitution and the, so to speak, dying Constitution or the conservative Constitution, would be able to coexist long enough, peacefully, for them to, in effect, converge. And for anything that was valuable in the original Constitution to be absorbed into the living Constitution. And so the future that liberals and many conservatives saw for decades and especially say in the 1940s and the 1950s, was for a peaceful future of coexistence and kind of co-evolution together. But then something happened in the 60s which changed that. The liberals radicalized for reasons which we will probably get into later in this panel and later this week, I'm sure. The liberals radicalized in the course of the 1960s, and in defense, conservatives had to radicalize too, in a way. Or at least they had to sharpen the difference between their constitution and the evolving constitution of the 1950s and 1960s mainstream liberalism. And so when that happened, as it were, the convergence and the surrender of the conservative side was off, and the cold Civil War was on at that point. When it became clear that conservatives were going to fight back, and that they were not going to be satisfied simply with slowing the pace of liberal progress into the future, or so-called progress into the future, but actually wanted intellectually and even politically to return American politics to the earlier Constitution, to fight and switch constitutions, as it were. The Civil War was really on. And that's the situation we are in now, I think. The reason for the immense polarization in our politics and the bitter divisions in our politics have to do with a real fight between two different visions of America, two different constitutions, two different ways of life, and the multicultural issues, the identity politics, the amazingly illiberal form of liberalism that we suffer from today is all those things are very much evidence that we are in a kind of cold Civil War situation where the country has to eventually decide which constitution will constitute it as a country, as a nation, and as a way of life. Because the two can't coexist much longer together peacefully, I think.
So Steve, you're going to talk about the past and future of conservatism at a subsequent point.
Right.
Well, what about liberalism since the 60s? I mean, how did we get from there to the woke-wazee today? And feel free to disagree with anything I said in the opening, or
yeah, no, I don't.
Yeah.
I think Charles is on the right track. I want to start actually with some more superficial things, though, to draw back to the
Sure.
heart of that better. In part because I'm not sure if you got author bios, but it's a long story. I'm currently at UC Berkeley, and it's often endless amusement for me. And one of the things, we have these measures of polarization now. It's all very finely calibrated with all these surveys. And I finally realized there's a comedian friend of mine, David Diebel, who's actually one of the few stand-up comics who's on our side, who looked at these surveys and said, oh, this is simple. What we know now is Republicans don't want their sons to marry Democrats, and Democrats don't want their sons to marry women. That's about where we are. That's why he gets there, right? I'm going to try and talk to Crystal people in the booking him for future cruises. He does All in America cruises a lot. Anyway. But political science is utterly clueless to understand this. And so again, under superficial measure, if you go back to that consensus period Charles mentioned in the 50s, and there's a lot to be said about that, because that consensus, although it was sort of more centrist, as you suggested, was also, it had the premise of progressivism that it didn't fully or consciously recognize. But what did the political science community say in the 50s and early 60s? They'd say the problem with our political parties is they're too homogeneous. You've got conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And as recently as 1981, in writing my Reagan book, I counted up the number of moderate to liberal Republican senators that Reagan had in the caucus. And I think I counted 16. It was people like Mac Mathias, Chuck Percy. Lowell Weicker was still in the Senate, a person Reagan referred to in his diary as a no-good, pompous fathead. Right? And Reagan in his diary complained more often about Republicans in Congress, in the House and Senate, than he did Democrats. He'd always say, they deserted us again on a key vote. And he talked about bitter arguments he had with Mark Hatfield of Oregon, right? A decent guy, but a very liberal Republican. Now you have maybe one, Susan Collins, right? And so what the political scientists said, and all the intellectuals of the 50s said, is we need more homogeneous political parties. We need parties that are ideologically coherent. Well, that's what we have now. And what do political scientists say? It's terrible. So, in other words, in the 50s, 60s, heterogeneous political parties bad. Today, homogeneous political parties bad, which shows political scientists have learned nothing in 50 years. And with the social science, they try and say it's all Republicans' fault. Remember, the Republican Party was founded as an extremist party, having been told their platform was unconstitutional by the Democratic Supreme Court. So it goes like that. It's a lot of fun. But that is said. Oh, sorry, I'm going on too long here. It is, if you read, just to pick one example, if you go back and read Arthur Schlesinger's best book, which is Grading on a Curve, is The Vital Center from 1950. First of all, that kind of liberalism is unrecognizable and gone today. But throughout that, he's very scornful of progressives. He didn't mean so much the formal progressives of the, say, Woodrow Wilson era. There's a little of that there. But he has in mind what is now you'd call the mainstream of the Democratic Party, right? I think. And one of Schlesinger's last books was Decrying Multiculturalism, if you'll remember. And so, you know, that kind of liberalism did die in the 60s. I think I've actually scribbled on my notes, May 68 may be the key month, not just in Paris, but in America, right around then. And liberals still want to celebrate that, and they get cross with us when we bring it up. I'll stop there because there's more to be said about all this.
Yeah, I know you've said, Charles, that part of this progression is the campus politics of the 60s that spread and deepened its roots has now spread to the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and liberals being accustomed to running the campus a certain way now want to run the country, or even the West that
true,
way.
Yes. No, you know, I mean, on all significant American college campuses, liberals rule, and there's really no fight. I mean, the academy is pristinely liberal, and the administration, which used to be a sort of, you know, middle of the road, sensible, sort of business Republican type group of people, is now farther left than the faculty in many respects. And the administration is no longer, you know, the alumnus who becomes a dean. There's a whole, it's a whole burgeoning specialty of, you know, assistant deans, and just an enormously multiplying bureaucracy, all of which is devoted to indoctrinating students in purer and purer doses of identity politics and radical liberalism. But the amazing thing is that having settled down and run the academy more or less in a totalitarian way, or an increasingly openly totalitarian kind of way, the university has become, in a way, the model for Democratic Party governance of the country at large. They want to run the country the way they run the university, as though it's a one-party state, and any opposition is illegitimate to them. It represents a constitution which now used to be denounced. The old Constitution used to be denounced by liberals as anti-democratic, as capitalist, as plutocratic. But now it's the one word which now encapsulates all of modern liberalism is racist. And the deepest indictment of the old Constitution is that it's a racist document, that it represents, you know, white supremacy, institutional racism, and so forth. By unconscious biases, you're a racist without even knowing or intending to be a racist, or being able to recognize your racism without the intervention of a professional diagnostician. And that is increasingly what the mainstream Democratic Party is all about. I mean, even in Hillary's campaign against Trump in 2016, by the end of the campaign, there was virtually no discussion of policy differences, except on the question, to some degree, of taxes or tax cuts. But the essential message of her campaign was Trump is a racist. He's a sexist. His voters, as you know, are deplorable and irredeemable. It is a direct indictment, not just of Trump, but of all of his supporters, as representing a deep sickness in American society. And that sickness has a name, and it's racism. And the question is, of course, where does the left go from there? If you really believe that half the country or so is irredeemably racist, how do you have a democratic form of government? I mean, the next question you have to ask is, why do these people have the vote? Why do we allow racists to vote? I mean, they're not American. They're racists. And that's the logic of the radicalized position now. That's where we're heading towards, I'd say.
And that's absolutely true in England as well, of course. As a result, the Brexit voters are now people who are, in a sense, they shouldn't have the vote.
That's
First,
right.
they shouldn't have the vote on two grounds. They're bigoted and xenophobic. But secondly, they're not going to be around for the consequences of their policies because they're older. So old people should have fewer votes, or maybe not, than younger people.
Ageism, yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. This is set by serious people.
Yeah. You want to answer?
Well, just to gild the point a little bit, so I wasn't planning to talk necessarily about the immediate scene with Trump and the Russian investigation and now the Ukrainian investigation, soon to become the Australian investigation. Eventually we'll get to Singapore and Shanghai.
Barr was just in Italy, right?
We got a
Right.
call this morning. They're saying he asked the same thing of the Chinese.
Good.
We're going to get one of these every couple of days.
This is great stuff on his part. This is merely the sort of blow-off stage of what is a long-running liberal theme going back maybe even as far as Eisenhower. That is not, and so say that half the American population roughly are deplorable and non-American is, they've actually thought, if you look closely, that every Republican president since Eisenhower has been illegitimate in one form or another. Eisenhower, well, he's a war hero, so it doesn't really count as reflective of some substrate of American opinion. Nixon cheated, we know, he was always tricky Dick, and Reagan was the Teflon president who fooled people. Even, he fooled 49 states somehow, right? George W. Bush won because of the Supreme Court, right? And so now Trump is illegitimate, right? But that is not just, I think that goes beyond just sour grapes of losing an election in dramatic fashion like Florida 2000 or this last election. I think it really is attached to their underlying philosophical premises, which are now part of the furnishings of the liberal mind, that they represent the side of history. So if history takes a wrong turn, there's something wrong with history and the people it has brought forward or washed up on shore. And so they really do think that way. And so there's no longer a rational argument. I like to say about, people talk about, the university is full of Marxists. I sometimes say, I wish that were still true. I mean, I remember Marxists when I was in college in the 70s. You could have an argument with a Marxist because at least they had a philosophical and economic and dialectical argument based in some form of reason. But now, if you, restate, I always say a racist is someone who disagrees with a liberal. So now you state a contrary position, and the argument doesn't start, it ends.
Right.
And it ends with the charge that you're, I got the whole list. You list out Islamophobic, that's part of the gallery now too, right? So you get all that, and where do you go from there? Nowhere.
It's a subgenre of racist. First Tom and then Rick. Tom.
I have 3 questions. I think they're
Only
related.
3?
I think they're related. If liberalism started with a commitment to free speech and divided over economic questions, how did we get from there to here? 2, what caused it? It seemed to arise extremely quickly. I don't see the evolution exactly. And the more difficult and more important question really is, what do we mean when we say it's a Cold War? What are the consequences? And I'm not sure what ultimately keeps it from being a hot war or something like a secession. As I wrote about, I can't even get a date with somebody who's now, I mean, that really goes down to something, I mean, I was married for many years to a very liberal feminist, but we got along fine. But we wouldn't today. I don't know if that necessarily leads to war, but leaving aside the personal question, I want to understand what Cold War means and how it gets resolved.
We can circulate Tom's piece. Matt published it on American Mind. It's called "A Deplorable Looks for a Date." Do you want to take the first question first?
Well, I guess I would have to question the hypothesis. If you said if liberalism began with free speech.
Well, I'm talking about the 60s.
Yeah. How did we get?
Free speech, and also the divide was more over economics than it is today. Even though it's come back to. But if the one word is racism,
right?
I'm not sure that would have been the word in 1960.
In a way, the 60s was a transitional period, because the question really is the character of the civil rights movement itself. I think that's really where your question goes, and it from the civil rights movement that conservatives like, and that they praise today, citing Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech at the Lincoln Memorial and so forth. That civil rights movement achieved all of its aims, essentially, or its essential aims, let's say, were achieved in 1964 and 1965 when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed. At that point, it should have gone out of business. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. himself said that. The civil rights agenda has been accomplished. But did it? No. You will notice that it had a way of reestablishing its relevance by redefining what civil rights were and turning them into an endless pursuit of equality of results, which required that every category, sexual, political, religious, and so forth, be re-examined for its adherence to an orthodoxy of equality of results, among other things, and so it in order to stay eternally relevant in its own definition, it had to be eternally transforming itself, and that is the opening, I think, that connects the early civil rights movement to our civil rights movement, which is similar. Only they share a name, but their objectives are really quite different, and even antithetical to what the objectives of the original civil rights movement were, as you can tell on college campuses when segregation, there's a new term, neo-segregation, on American college campuses, because, as you know, it is now very fashionable to have black graduations, black dormitories, Hispanic, award ceremonies of various kinds. All the things which were being attacked by the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s have now been baptized in the new civil rights movement as requirements of racial diversity, inclusion, and equality. And the interesting question for American conservatives, and the book by Chris Caldwell that Ryan alluded to earlier, is going to be a very interesting moment in this emerging discussion. I think for conservatives, it's going to be very interesting to have to revisit the history of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and of the civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of things which National Review said about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, early 1960s and late 50s, it was very it was a little bit divided on the question. It had some writers who were generally in favor of the Civil Rights Act, for example, and others who counseled a vote against the Civil Rights Act on constitutional and other grounds. But I would have to say that many of the cautionary notes that National Review sounded in the early 1960s have proved to be wise in hindsight. I mean, many of the problems which they foresaw of the transformational danger in the agenda and the permanent enlargement of the federal government's functions and so forth that would follow from the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act in all of the panoply of ways that it would be enforced. Many of those look quite wise now in retrospect. the Claremont Institute has always been a friend of the civil rights agenda and of Abraham Lincoln and his role in American politics and so forth, it does give you pause to see all the mischief that has been wrought out of the cause of civil rights.
Steve, what do you think is keeping our Civil War cold?
I'm almost tempted to say geography, right? The first Civil War was really a geographically based, we call it a civil war, but you got armies in the field in uniforms like a regular war, right? And now there had been some violence. The media wants to talk about Charlottesville every day because it happened once, and that's all they've got, and they've forgotten about the guy who tried to shoot several Republican members of Congress, right? That was real shooting, and that, I don't know if it's going to be worse, but that would be odd. I sort of take it literally. And it's dispersed, right? You couldn't say the coast against the heartland, and good luck with that for the coast. That's what I always say. The broader point Tom raises, though, is two things. I think you want to go back a step earlier than free speech, because the free speech movement, they didn't actually mean it. That was always just a tactic to bash college administrations, narrowly speaking, but society more broadly. And it's fun to go back and read some of the older liberals who were there, for example, at Berkeley in '64, like Nathan Glazer, the people who later became neoconservatives. And they were kind of confused, but they said, there's a dogmatism at the heart of this that's very worrying to us. They'd only later get it fully and understand how serious and insidious a dogmatism it was, because they were kind of sympathetic. Glazer tried to work out a faculty compromise and all that, that collapsed, and okay. Free speech was ancillary. I always say that I think where you get to your point is you go to Mill's first principle before free speech, which is liberalism is about individuals get to do what they want. In other words, the unleashing and sanctifying of the individual will. And so the free speech movement and all the things that flow from it are the left fundamentally at this deep philosophical level, before you even get to their historicism of the side of history. They are offended, I'll put it that way, by anything that's a constraint on the human will. And since politics should be all about, in their point of view, the process by which we impose our will or achieve our will, which they think everyone has the same will if you're good, if you're non-deplorable, right? That explains, I think, the depth of their anger or the ferocity of their political passions. So ultimately, one of the interesting things happening right now, we'll talk about this later on in the week, is this whole questioning, most clearly I think coming from Catholic thinkers like Patrick Deneen, that the core idea of liberalism itself needs to be rethought and qualified.
Very high.
Special thanks to our guests Charles Kesler, Ryan Williams, and of course our Steve Hayward. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.